So today I'm going to talk about how timbre affects our perception of musical tension. And in particular, I'm going to examine a set of common timbre attributes that and discuss how they directly affect listener judgments of tension. So when I say musical tension, what am I talking about exactly? Well, first of all, I mean, this might sound a little bit familiar or it might be intuitive, but tension is really an aggregate of a wide range of musical and auditory features. It's a fundamental aspect of how listeners interpret and enjoy music. The music without any tension is generally boring music, unless, of course, you need to take a break or have a nap or something like that. So in this talk, I will discuss the results of 3 experiments. In the first 2 experiments, I used artificially generated stimuli, so essentially synthesized sounds, while the 3rd experiment used real music. So this last experiment was also exploratory in that it attempted to look at the bigger picture when it came to integrating auditory and visual information. So it includes a visual component in an effort to better understand how evolving auditory and visual features, when I say auditory, I mean timbre in particular, interact to induce a feeling of changing tension. Now, I know all of you already know what timbre is, but I really like this definition of timbre by Stephen McAdams. And it's actually a great definition because it's helpful to keep in mind when categorizing the various musical and auditory features that contribute to tension perception. So I'm just going to read it because I really like it. Timbre covers many parameters of perception that are not accounted for by pitch, loudness, spatial position, duration, or even by various environmental characteristics such as room reverberation. So when you think about features such as, melody, harmony, loudness, tempo, right? I mean, these are obviously characteristics that contribute to tension, but they also clearly fit in the not timbre category. And I think all of us would agree that, harmony is wonderful, but timbre is also a very important contributor to how we perceive tension. And as Asteris mentioned, that despite this fact, timbre has received relatively little attention in empirical work in the context of tension specifically. And perhaps this is in part due to the general difficulty in defining its perceptual dimensions. So while contributions of features such as harmony and melody have been examined thoroughly in past studies, it's still unclear how and which timbral features contribute most directly to musical tension. So that's what I'm going to explore today in my talk. So just to summarize past work has examined features like roughness, brightness, spectral flatness, and density in the context of tension. Okay, so the first study I'm going to talk about consisted of 2 experiments. So I'll call them experiments 1 and 2. And these experiments examined the contribution of 5 specific timbre attributes to auditory and musical tension. So in order to determine which of these timbre descriptors were particularly worth examining in the context of tension, I did a number of things. First, I consulted with my MIR colleagues, my music information retrieval colleagues. I also looked at existing literature to see which spectral features were frequently cited as important in differentiating instrumental timbres, as well as just attributes commonly utilized in various MIR applications. So I thought that was a good way of kind of finding some key features. So this is the list I came up with. First, there's Inharmonicity, which is a feature that is based on how partials are offset from integer multiples of the fundamental frequency of a pitch. Then there's Roughness, of course, which is also known as sensory dissonance. And that's present when pairs of sinusoids are close enough in frequency such that the listener experiences a beating sensation. Then there's spectral centroid, which is often associated with perceived brightness, although they are not necessarily synonymous. And that's defined as the weighted mean of the energy found in different frequency bins that are produced by a Fourier transform. Then there's spectral deviation, which is also sometimes called spectral spread. And that's attained by calculating the spread of the energy distribution across the spectrum. So for example, a pure tone will have no spectral deviation. Then there's spectral flatness, also sometimes called noisiness. And that corresponds to how similar a signal of the spectrum of a signal is to white noise. So low spectral flatness corresponds to more pitched sounds. Okay, So the goal of these two experiments was to systematically examine how changes in these 5 timbre attributes contribute directly to changes in perceived tension. The directionality of attributes was also examined. So that is whether if you increase a particular attribute, it contributes to an increase in tension, or the opposite way around, or if this relationship is not clear. So for both of these experiments, 2 states were generated for each feature. One with a minimum of that particular attribute, which I call state A, and then state B, which had some maximum or significantly more of that particular attribute. So I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But when possible, I did make an effort to avoid covariance between features because I was going to synthesize the stimuli. I wanted to give special attention to keeping spectral centroid constant in cases where it was not the targeted changing feature in the stimuli. And this is due to the established importance of centroid in timbre discrimination experiments. So I thought that was like especially important. Since loudness is known to be a dominant factor in auditory perception experiments and certainly a very important factor in tension perception, loudness was of course equalized for all stimuli. Overall intensity level equalization was automatically done using the EchoNest API, so that loudness differences across stimuli were less than 1 dB. And then I used the Genesis loudness toolbox from MATLAB to obtain time-dependent psychoacoustic loudness measures for each synthesized timbre. And this was for verification purposes, because I could hear things, by ear, but I also wanted to have an objective measure. And then amplitude envelopes and changes in intensity were applied to compensate for temporal changes in loudness, as well as differences in loudness between the stimuli. So after the stimuli were generated, which was all done in MATLAB, they were double-checked using the MIR toolbox to analyze each timbre attribute, so to provide some objective measure, so that I just wasn't, simply assuming that, these timbre attributes were changing. Okay, so for each feature, a stimulus was created that morphed from state A, the minimum state, to state B, the maximum state, or the opposite way, from B to A, or did not change over time. So completely static, like starting on A and just staying the same, starting on B, staying the same. In addition, there were 4 different durations for each stimulus. So the stimuli could morph over 1, 5, 10, or 15 seconds, resulting in a total of 60 stimuli. So that's 5 features by the 3 types of changes, by the 4 different durations. There were 50 subjects, mostly musicians, who took part in this first experiment. The participants were asked to judge how they felt tension changed over the course of each sound by selecting one of the following multiple choice responses. So we have increasing tension, decreasing tension, no change, or optionally none of the above. So let me play you a few examples of what this stimuli sounded like. Now, all of these are 10 seconds in duration, and they also morph from state A to state B. So in all cases, you have increasing amounts of each timbre attribute. So here's an example of inharmonicity increasing. Oh no! All right, here we go. Shoot, I can't click on this. Okay, I'm going to try to reshare my screen again. Sorry about this. I don't know what's wrong with this. I can't click on my sound files. Let me try restarting my slides. Okay, here we go. I don't know what's happening here, but it seems to be working now. Okay, and here's an example of roughness increasing over 10 seconds. Oh no, what is going on here? I can't. This is very strange. Okay, here we go. this is spectral centroid increasing. And spectral deviation. Strange. I don't understand why this is acting so strangely. Okay, let me try to change my slides. Apologies, I have no idea what's going on with my computer. All right, I'm gonna have to quit again, I guess. Okay, did I do spectral deviation? No, right? All right, I'll play it. And spectral flatness increasing. Okay, so just to make a long story short, the results were all over the place. And maybe you could have guessed that from just listening to the stimuli, but here, for example, are the results for spectral centroid. So you have 3 graphs here, one representing the responses to going from state A to state B, those stimuli, state B to state A, so decreasing in amount of that particular attribute, and then no change. And so as you can see, and also the colored bars represent the duration. So darker bars represent shorter durations, longer bars are represented by the lighter colors. As you can see, there's no rhyme or reason to these responses. And even if you look at the no change case, there are quite a number of subjects that selected increasing tension, even though there was no change at all. So more on that in a moment. And just to quickly go through the other results, spectral deviation results were also conflicting. And in this case, I mean, it really appears that any change, whether an increase or decrease in spectral deviation, corresponded to an increase in tension, which you can see by the responses of increasing tension being the most popular here for both the increasing and decreasing cases of spectral deviation. And again, the no change did elicit quite a number of increasing tension responses. And here's spectral flatness. And in this case, both pitch and loudness appear to be an issue. And this is due to the perception of essentially crescendos and diminuendos or decrescendos resulting from the source separation of noise and pitch. So the perceived fading or increase in one or the other feature or sound source. So depending on which aspect, noise versus tone, the listener's attention was drawn to, either an increase or decrease in loudness could have been salient. So this might explain any lack of a clear trend in the results, as you can see. Now, inharmonicity was more strongly correlated with increase in tension when the stimuli duration was longer, as you can see here, most likely because the pitch shifts that were apparent became slower and less noticeable. At least that's my theory. However, as shown in these graphs, a reverse pattern of response was not evident in the opposing case. So when inharmonicity was decreasing. Okay, so the short version of this is these results are confusing and difficult to interpret. Okay, so these are the results for roughness. The duration of the stimuli seemed to have an effect with the largest differences between the 1 second case and the other durations, you can see here. Now it's interesting to note that the longer the stimulus, the more often subjects felt tension was increasing in the no change case. And this is definitely the same thing for all the different attributes. And this might be due to the fact that the stimuli were pretty tense sounding to begin with, and prolonged exposure to a static sound basically became increasingly unpleasant. And in fact, a number of subjects commented that they found the experiment irritating or annoying to listen to. So that kind of puts things in context. Okay, so obviously, if it isn't apparent from the stimuli I played earlier, there were way too many confounding factors. The results of experiment 1 were inconsistent and contradictory overall. And there were really few clear trends or certainly no directionality indicated in the responses. And it appeared that the process of morphing introduced certain artifacts such as unintended pitch glides. So this was apparently the case most problematically for inharmonicity. So for example, you can really hear pitch glides like in this short sample of a stimulus where inharmonicity is changing. And also multiple sources, as I mentioned before, became an issue in some cases, and certainly in the stimuli where inharmonicity was changing, if it was really stretched out over a period of time, you start to hear like different kinds of pitched sounds, pitch glides that seem to diverge. So here's an example of that. And there was, of course, an issue of loudness, believe it or not, even though I went through, a great deal of effort to avoid this issue. Loudness and pitch issues for spectral flatness, and that wasn't due to I think, due to the nature of the stimuli. So it was another problem with multiple sources where there was this noise component, there was this pitch component. So depending on whether you listen to one or the other, it might sound like it's increasing in intensity or decreasing in intensity. Right, that tone gets pretty intense at the end. It sounds like it's increasing in loudness, but overall it's not, if you include the noise component. Okay, so in summary, it appears that in many cases, listeners were responding more to changes in pitch than changes in a featured attribute, the target attribute. And the basic problem was that it was impossible to control for all these factors, given that these were pretty complex stimuli, the way they morphed. So given these mixed results, I designed a second experiment to try to avoid the pitfalls encountered in morphing sound from one state to another. Now, I talked about experiment one quite a bit, and the truth of the matter is, this is clearly a failed experiment, right? It will never be published. But, for me, of course, it helped inform the work that came after it. Okay, so experiment 2. This experiment features stimuli designed to compare static versions of states A and B separated by 1.2 seconds of silence. So this was actually a much more simple set of stimuli. Also, there were 3 different pitch registers that I utilized for each condition, which I term low, mid, and high. So for all of these state A, state B pairs, there were now 4 possible orderings. There was A and then B and then A, or A repeated or B repeated. And participants were asked to judge which of the 2 sounds, first one or second one, was more tense, or if they sounded the same. There were 46 subjects this time around, again, mostly musicians. So let me play some examples of the stimuli. They all go from state A to state B. This is inharmonicity. And that's in the high pitch register. And roughness in the mid pitch register. Spectral centroid in the mid pitch register. Uh-oh, it's in that state again. Oh no. Oops. Ah, here we go. And spectral deviation. This is the high pitch register, and spectral flatness in the mid pitch register. It's a very different experience than listening to the morphing stimuli, obviously. Okay, so let's look at the results. So unlike the case for experiment 1, the results of experiment 2 were very consistent. And really there were increases in all features corresponding very strongly with changes in tension, so increase in tension. So here are the results for inharmonicity. You have the 3 different figures for the order of the stimuli presented. So state A to B, B to A, AA or BB repeated, response percentages based on whether subjects chose same, that A was more tense or that B was more tense. And also you can see the different colored bars in this case represent the pitch register as opposed to duration from experiment 1. Okay, so if there was any real difference in response due to pitch register, perhaps I would say the highest register resulted in slightly less agreement. Okay, these are the results for roughness. Again, you get this pretty clear profile where B is selected as more tense, regardless of the order. And these are the results for spectral deviation. Again, you see a clear selection of B, more spectral deviation, as being more tense, regardless of order. And these are the results for spectral flatness. Again, very clear responses for B being more tense. And finally, these are the results for spectral centroid, which were also statistically significant, but as you can tell, not as clear-cut as the other features. And one thing I noted was they appeared to be more variable depending on pitch register. So I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. Okay, so in summary, there was overall positive evidence for the contribution of all these attributes to perceived tension. However, if correlation of features is taken into account, and this is something I won't go into here, the strongest evidence supporting the contributions of these attributes would be for inharmonicity, roughness, and spectral flatness directly contributing to tension. Okay, so how does this all relate back to prior work? Well, for example, the concept of noisiness as tension inducing is pretty intuitive, right? For example, there's a great deal of literature on environmental noise as a source of psychological stress. So perhaps that's not so surprising. Now, in the case of inharmonicity and roughness, they are both associated with dissonance, which is, of course, an important concept in music. Roughness, in particular, in previous work, has been directly implicated as a contributor to tension. So that's one feature that I clearly expected to get good results for, given past work. On the other hand, the slightly ambiguous responses to spectral centroid were surprising to me, given the close association between centroid and brightness. And in fact, prior work has indicated that brighter instrument sounds are perceived as more tense. However, there's also been some work on emotion and music that has shown no impact of centroid on psychological arousal. And arousal is very closely linked to tension perception. So it's kind of conflicting. So, okay, so while there is some evidence, including, I would say, from the studies, the study I presented for spectral centroid contributing to perceived tension, I can't say that it's, at this point, definitive. But more on that later. All right, so now let's take a step back for a moment and look at the big picture. I've talked about a couple experiments which are for the most part exploratory. I looked at some popular timbre attributes and tried to ascertain how they contributed to tension. This study was, in fact, one in a series of studies where I looked at various musical features, not just timbre, and how they influenced tension perception. So based on these earlier studies that focused on features other than timbre, I developed a computational model that, given a quantitative description of the individual features, would produce an accurate global tension prediction. So what do I mean by accurate? I mean a prediction that matches the empirical data. Okay, so this figure on the slide here is an example of the type of data I used to develop my model. So you can see that the colored lines represent quantified features for one particular musical excerpt. In this case, it was a 1-minute excerpt from a classical piece, a Vivaldi concerto. What you see here is this black line in the middle is the mean continuous tension response from listeners from this experiment. And I know the legend is hard to read because it's kind of small, but the colored lines represent a harmony, loudness, melodic expectation, onset frequency, and pitch height of various lines, the melody, the bass, and the inner lines. Okay, so I had noticed in prior work on tension that regression models were sometimes used to understand how individual features correlated to tension responses. So for example, if loudness was highly correlated with attention response, you can say, oh, well, that means that loudness must be contributing to tension. However, these regression models had not been used to actually predict data. So I tried standard machine learning approach of using some of the data for training the regression model, and in this case, a minimum of the first 3/4 of the listener's mean tension response for each excerpt of music, and then using the remaining data to compare against the model's prediction. So you can see from these figures, these are 2 examples. The figures show the empirical data, that is the mean tension response by the listeners, as a solid line, and the estimated tension by a regression model. So left of the vertical line shows the training portion of the data in both cases. And everything to the right of the line shows the model prediction compared to the empirical data. So the top figure here shows the results for a linear model, and the bottom figure shows the results for a quadratic model. Now, I tried both linear and nonlinear models, and the results were just not good. And even when I used more than 3/4 of the empirical data to train the model, it was still really bad. And you can see that the nonlinear model, the quadratic model here, was able to fit the training data quite well. But when you look at the prediction results, I mean, it's all over the place due to overfitting, and it kind of blows up here. So not good. Okay, so the primary problem with the regression approach was the fact that the models were unable to capture the moment-to-moment experience of music listening. One thing I noted from previous experiments was the importance of trends. The idea of trend salience became the basis for my next approach, which I will refer to as a temporal model because it was designed to take into account the real-time nature of music listening. So this model includes 3 major components. There's an attentional window that models a perceptual moving window in time and extracts a current tension trend. Then there's a memory window, which is defined simply as the direction of the tension trend in a window of time immediately preceding the attentional window. So this temporal model essentially defines tension as a function of musical features by estimating the combined directional change of all the features in each attentional window and using this information to generate tension predictions. So this combined directional change, or what I call the tension trend for an attentional window, is weighted by what immediately precedes it in the memory window, as well as the perceptual weights of the individual musical parameters. Because, you know, when it comes to tension perception, the effect of loudness is clearly stronger than the effect of, I don't know, melodic expectation. Okay, so these differing weights, which are very important, which basically define the influence of various musical parameters, were derived, I didn't just make them up, they were derived from the experimental data. Okay, so what I did was I looked at a whole bunch of different memory and attentional window sizes. So they were variables in the model. So in order to optimize the model, I tested many different window sizes ranging from 0 to 8 seconds for the memory window and 1 to 8 seconds for the attentional window. And you can see in this figure over here, the different colored lines represent different memory window sizes, 0 to 8. The x-axis represents the attentional window sizes, and the y-axis represents the correlation, that is the R values, between the model output and the actual mean listener judgments of tension. So obviously the higher the R value, the better. Means the prediction is better. The flat gray line in the center represents the results for no memory window size, or memory window of 0 seconds. And it's interesting to note that, that these results vary very little when there's no memory window at all. Now, the optimal model performance appears to be right up here at this peak here, where both the memory and attentional windows are 3 seconds long. And in fact, I have found that the 3-second memory window is really optimal in all cases across the board, regardless of the features that are used. It just seems to come up over and over again, this 3-second memory window. Okay, So these are the results of the temporal model on 2 classical music excerpts approximately a minute long, including the one that I showed in an earlier slide with the regression model results. That's the bottom one here. As you can see, the predictions, the dotted lines, really match the actual tension responses quite well. So the actual tension response is a solid line. Okay, so at this point, I was satisfied that I had a viable computational model of tension. Of course, it's not perfect, but I mean, it's impossible to have perfect in this case. And so that leads me to my final experiment that I'll talk about on timbre and tension. Okay, to recap, I had conducted a couple of experiments with synthesized stimuli, and now I wanted to look at how those 5 timbre descriptors contribute to tension in the concept of real music. So by real music, I mean 2.5-minute excerpts from electronic art music, electronic compositions by Stockhausen, Nono, and Taehong Park. The idea was to evaluate how these different features contributed to tension by utilizing my model, the one I just talked about. I would optimize it by finding the feature weights and the window sizes that best predicted the tension responses. And these optimized parameter values could then shed some light on how these individual features contributed to listener perceptions. And I also had another motivation, although it was not my primary one. So one example of how effectively timbre can manipulate tension perception is found in film scores. I once had a student who did an interesting thesis project on film music and emotion, and he used the visuals of the title sequence of Kubrick's famous horror film, The Shining. And you can see some screenshots of the title sequence here from that movie. The original score for this sequence is pretty ominous. It's some version of Dies Irae, so creepy, right? But what my student did was he replaced that original soundtrack with 3 very different scores. So one was somber, another cheerful and bouncy, and the third jazzy and sort of chill, if I recall correctly. Unfortunately, I don't actually remember much else about the experiment, except that I found the stimuli to be highly entertaining. I mean, it's amazing how the different scores completely change the feel of the sequence. And it completely changed the general tension conveyed by the opening sequence overall. So what I wanted to do, in addition to using real music in this third experiment, I wanted to explore how visual tension might interact with auditory tension. Okay, so prior studies on audiovisual tension tend to focus on high-level or even artistic elements. For example, film music and its effect on story interpretation, just like the experiment that I talked about that my student did with the Shining sequence. But I wanted to avoid any semantic associations that might be evoked by the visual component. And this is a big issue. I wanted to focus on low-level audiovisual components. So timbre in the auditory case, and then something analogous in the visual case. So in other words, I wanted to focus on auditory and visual features that are more universal and less culturally or semantically influenced. So when it came to auditory features, since I'm using real music, no matter what kind of music it is, I mean, loudness and texture are going to be important in addition to timbre. So the auditory features I focused on here, or I included in my analysis, were loudness, onset frequency as a stand-in for texture, and then timbre, which was represented by the 5 attributes that I've been talking about. Now, with the visual features, it took me a while to come up with this list of 4 features, and I actually ran some pilot studies before I decided to use them. The visual features I decided to use were speed of motion, coherence of motion, brightness, and contrast. Okay, so the visual part of the stimuli consisted of different types of changes in the visual parameters. Or in the case of the audio-only versions of the stimuli, no visuals at all, so like just a static black screen. And these were animations, so they were continuously moving dots. And the animations were designed to reflect 3 general types of changes in the visual field: random changes, gradual ramps or shorter ramps. And these changes were visualized using monochromatic random dot kinematograms, which are commonly used in vision research. The number and size of dots were generated to take up exactly half of the available screen space in order to allow for equal proportions of foreground and background brightness. So I could alter the brightness of the dots, and I could alter the brightness of the background, and I could alter how fast the dots are moving and how coherent the motion of the dots were. So we're talking about like random walk Brownian motion here. And here's a screenshot of what the visuals look like. So this was all done using Psych Toolbox and MATLAB. It's a freeze frame, so you can't see the dots moving around, but it had a very organic feel. And at the bottom, you can see a slider. And this slider was used by the subjects to report tension in real time as they were experiencing the stimuli. So 45 participants took part in the experiment. There were 15 total stimuli, each 2.5 minutes long. There were 3 audio excerpts and 3 visual animations that were presented individually, so by themselves, only visual, only auditory, as well as all 6 possible pairings of each audio excerpt and visual animation. So I'll play you a little bit of each musical excerpt so you get an idea of what the music sounded like. So here, I'm not going to play the whole thing because they're pretty long. So this is the Taehang Park excerpt. Okay, see, I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna have to play just a very short bit of the other 2 excerpts. So this is the, oops, uh-oh. Maybe I won't be able to play it. Ah, it's in that state again. I have no idea why this is doing that. Okay. Oh no. Ah, here we go. Stockhausen. Okay, I was not able to stop it, so I'm going to try to. I have no idea what's wrong with my slides. It's not letting me. Oh, here we go. The no excerpt. Okay, so you get the idea. I mean, obviously, there's a reason why I chose these excerpts. So in terms of the visual animations, there were contrasting types of changes. So quickly, V1 consisted of periodic random changes. V2 consisted of these slow increases and decreases kind of coordinated between the visual features. And the third one, V3, was the most complex, consisting of lots of long and short ramps as well as abrupt changes in features. Okay, so quickly, in order to analyze the data, I applied my attention model using the audio and visual features in question, and I optimized the durations of the memory and attentional windows for each feature, as well as the general model that integrated the features. I don't have time to explain this in detail, but the idea is that each feature has its own attentional window, as well as the model as a whole. The feature weights and whether they were even necessary were obtained in a manner similar to stepwise regression. So all features were given equal weight initially, and then individually removed to see if the predictions improved. So the decision to retain or eliminate features and assign relative weights were done using only the audio only and visual only stimuli. Okay, so quickly, the optimized model for the audio only stimuli retained only loudness, spectral centroid, roughness, and onset frequency. And all the weights, as you can see, were equal except for loudness, which was twice that of the other features, which is not surprising given the importance of loudness. And as you can see, the attentional feature window sizes are all similar except for onset frequency, which apparently takes a little more time to process. Now, the mean correlation coefficient, Spearman's rho in this case, between the audio-only stimuli and the predictions produced by the model was very high. It was 0.81. Now, one thing of note is the importance of spectral centroid here. The fact that it was retained in the optimized model along with roughness, while inharmonicity, spectral flatness, and spectral deviation were not retained, implies that at least in the given these musical inputs, and that despite the ambiguous results from the prior experiments I talked about, spectral centroid does play an important role in tension perception. Okay, so quickly, just to view what the data look like, here you have the Park, the Stockhausen no-no excerpts, black line in the middle, and the blue line here represent the mean tension responses. Colored lines represent the retained features in the optimized model. And here over on the right, you can see that the tension predictions are in the red line, are the red line. And in some cases, it matches the empirical data really quite closely. In other cases, it's, you know, so-so, but overall, it's pretty good. Okay, visual only results. The optimized model for the visual only stimuli retained all 4 features. So speed of motion, contrast, coherence, brightness, with speed having the greatest weight, followed by contrast. Then coherence and brightness had a slight negative contribution to tension, but they were still important enough to be included. The mean correlation coefficient between the visual only stimuli and the predictions was also quite high, 0.72. So not as high as the audio only case, but still, I mean, given the complexity of the stimuli, I would think it's pretty good. Okay, so here's what the data looked like here. You can see the features and how they change for V1, V2, and V3. And black line here and the blue line on the right are the empirical data, so the tension responses, and the red line is the model prediction. You can see it's actually, you know, not so bad. Okay, now the final results, the audiovisual results. So I retained all the features that were in the audio only and visual only models for the audiovisual model. When tested on stimuli with both audio and visual components, the best results were obtained when audio features were given twice the weight or more than the visual features. So the optimized model for the audio plus visual stimuli resulted in a mean correlation coefficient of 0.67. So it ranged from a minimum of 0.31 to a maximum of 0.87. So there was a range. So obviously it did not do as well as the audio only and visual only models, but in general, the model did really quite well, particularly in predicting more local tension changes. So if you take a look at this, here's just one example of the model inputs and outputs shown alongside the mean tension responses. And this is the stimulus that combined A1, I think that's the Park excerpt, with V2, which is like more coordinated changes in the visual features. You can see that the prediction is really quite good in this case. So this is probably the best of the results. Okay, so to sum everything up, perhaps the most interesting result from experiment 3 is the fact that the audio had a much stronger effect on subject judgments than the visual component. That might be no surprise to some of you. So when the model was optimized to fit the mean responses, the feature with the greatest weight was found to be loudness, followed by spectral centroid, roughness, onset frequency, and speed of motion, all equal in weight. Then by contrast, and finally with much smaller negative contributions from coherence of motion and brightness. So overall, the optimal attentional windows both within and between auditory and visual domains were mostly the same or fairly close, right? Generally under 3 seconds. This is indicative of the fact that these are low-level features and they're being processed on relatively short timescales. In contrast, a high-level musical feature such as harmony, as in like Western common practice harmony, would have a far longer attentional window, optimal attentional window. So in conclusion, these studies are part of an ongoing exploration that has both a scientific and artistic component. I've also been thinking of possible creative applications of this work, and Asteris mentioned this in the intro. For example, can an understanding of how timbre contributes to tension aid in the development of algorithmic or computer-assisted composition systems? And this is an area that I've also done some work in. Regarding the visual component, perhaps this work could help inform approaches to performance or composition involving visuals of some kind. This work might also inform the development of some kind of tool for analyzing audiovisual media from a perceptual perspective. And this is beyond or even in support of the semantic or cultural aspects of those media. Finally, it's my hope that the work I presented today can ultimately help us better understand how music is experienced and enjoyed. Okay, so as a final note, for those of you who are curious to read more about some of the work I've mentioned in my talk, there's a paper published in JASA, the Journal of the Acoustic Society of America, that describes experiment 2 in detail. There's another paper in Music Perception from 2012 that provides a good overview of my tension model for those of you who are curious to know more about it. And all of these papers can be found on my personal website. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
So everyone, we would like to promote oral questions. So if you want to ask a question, I suggest you go to participants, and then it should be an option raise hand, where the quickest one gets the question first. And but if you're camera shy, then you can also type in the question, and I will be able to ask it myself. So let's see if there are any questions, any raised hands. Let me see, am I missing something? Let me see participants. Yeah, okay. I give the speech to Caro. Wait a minute. Yeah, you're unmuted, and if you, Karen, if you'd like, you can turn your camera off as well, on as well. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome.
I have a question. I don't know if you said it before, but how do you obtain the figures that model the tension parameters from a musical sample?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question one more time?
How do you obtain the figures that model the tension parameters, the descriptors?
Well, there are two ways of doing it. One is, you do it by hand, which is not recommended, but I have done that in the past, especially for features that require a lot of calculation. Like, for example, harmony has to be quantified somehow. So I've used Lerdahl's tonal tension model for just the harmony. But you can use some kind of dissonance model as well, right? So you can either extract these features directly from the audio, or you can have like a score-based approach and analyze it that way.
Okay, thanks.
Well, in the case of timbre, it was all objectively obtained. So I just, I used MATLAB functions to to generate the descriptions.
Okay, thank you. Next one is Eddie. I'm unmuting you, Eddie, and you can turn on your camera if you like.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for the talk. Well, I had a question related to how melodic expectation was computed, but then I guess it was based on Lerdahl's
well, no, actually, I used Margulis's melodic expectation model. And what I found is that melodic expectation is a terrible predictor for tension. It's too like note by note. And it's very sort of all over the map. You don't get trends in melodic tension. melodic expectation. Really the main, what I found contributing to tension the most from a melodic perspective was contour, so pitch height. That was really the main contributor.
Yeah, because I was curious, how would that be calculated in a Stockhausen piece, for example?
Oh, no. See, I intentionally chose pieces that were not discrete pitched in nature. I didn't want melodies, you know, I didn't want any of that. I just really wanted to focus on on timbre as the primary way of conveying musical structure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next one. Magnus, I give you the word. I'm unmuting you. Okay.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear me now.
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. But I'm unable to start my video, so you won't see my face.
Oh,
I think
okay.
you can live without that, as long as you can hear my voice. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have just one question about the first experiment. One, there's it seems like everything was prepared and ready to run a MANOVA, so a multivariate analysis of variance. Did you do that? What were the
No, I didn't do that because, you know, I looked at the results and I pretty much gave up. It was just so disappointing and such a mess that I said, forget it. This is not even, you know, there's not much I can do about this. I think what I did, it was quite a while ago now. I think I did some, yeah, I think I did some kind of chi-square test, if I recall correctly, to see whether the actual response profiles were statistically significant, the differences.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious. So maybe that could be somehow possible to do.
Yeah, I suppose it's possible, but as I said, I don't think anyone would.
Juicy data to try some analysis on, and then for your second experiment there with the time series. So how did you deal with the serial dependency and the autoregression in the time series that you're having there?
No, I didn't. So do you mean the regression model or the?
Yeah. So when for the regression model that you eventually sets up, as you know, in pretty much any and every series that you are dealing with, and certainly the ones that you have there, there will be some kind of autoregressive characteristics, and if
that is true.
The series predicts itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that needs to be taken care of when you set up the prediction modeling.
Yeah, I mean, I did not do that initially when I tried the regression approach, but it was not like it was more kind of an experiment where I wanted to see just basically what the output would look like. And I think fundamentally I felt that from a cognitive perspective, it was just not the right approach to begin with. So, but you're right. I mean, I could have taken a lot more things into account when I did it, but I think I sort of followed my my instinct that really the way to look at how people experience tension is not something that was kind of a long-term, like, it had to take into account what happened immediately previously to the current focus. Does that make sense? And I didn't see how I could do that with the regression model.
No, I think I see what you mean, but I have to read the papers. I mean, I'm curious if the model that you used is a pure linear regression or minimizing OLS, or is it some kind of black box machine learning?
Oh, no black box. No.
Yeah.
These were like very simple models. I mean, they were as simple as you can imagine.
Yeah. No, those are the best. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, next in line, John van der Veld. I'm unmuting you. Hopefully this would work. Come
on. Yes, hi. So as someone who's fairly unfamiliar with your research and research into timbre, you had mentioned something about experiment 2 about how changes were consistent when only 2 pitches were given and there was a brief pause in the middle. I was just wondering if you could just expand upon that, because that was fairly interesting how when you took out the sloping line of the sound and the reverberation and whatnot, you got much more succinct results. So I was just wondering if what that proved, or any further results that you could share.
Well, I think that the main problem with the experiment 1 stimuli was simply that there were too many artifacts that had nothing to do with timbre, that were very salient in some of the stimuli. So I mentioned, you know, the pitch glides. I mean, pitch is such an important part of how we perceive tension that if you hear pitch changes, you're naturally going to gravitate toward them. And I think that was the primary issue that I found. It was just not possible to do the morphing without these artifacts being present. So does that answer your question or no?
Oh yeah, there's a thumbs up there. So
oh, okay, I missed the thumbs up.
Okay, so I'm putting one last question through from Peter Cariani, which says, do you have any sense of how many dimensions we'll need to adequately capture timbral space? There's a host of timbral distinctions based on onset dynamics, attack order of harmonics, and variability in coherence of a medium length temporal window infrapitch. Dimensions related to onset would require discrete events, discontinuities. Yeah. How do you think about timbre space in general? What are the fundamental problems we need to solve?
Oh, wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I would have to say that I actually don't know how many features. Okay, short answer is I think there are probably a whole amalgam of many different kinds of timbre descriptors you could come up with that contribute to tension. And some of them overlap, right? So it's not like they're necessarily completely distinct from each other. Just looking at what I've seen from my own data, you know, I thought that the 5 descriptors that I used, especially when it came to doing the audio only analysis with the real music, I think they were fairly good at accounting for the variability in the tension changes. So I would say that if you could probably come up with a set of anywhere from 5 to 10 features that would do an excellent job of pretty much defining, you know, the major contributions to tension from timbre. That'd be my guess.
Okay, I hope this answers the question. And I'm afraid we don't have more time for any other questions. I would have a few, but maybe I'll keep them for social event or somewhere else if you join us, Dr. Farbood. So one more round for applause for Dr. Farbood. Thank you very much for this talk. It was very inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks.